Hi guys, if you listen closely, right now, you can hear it, a low, distant hum vibrating against the glass of your window, like a frequency too deep for human ears, or perhaps just the massive weight of the void pressing in on the fragile edges of your reality. That's the sound of the silence I've learned to fear. Don't look behind you right now, but know that sometimes, the only thing separating us from the deep dark is the quality of the static we choose to ignore. We're going somewhere tonight that exists outside of time, and once we cross that threshold, nothing can bring us back, except perhaps a choice made in the face of absolute despair. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are and what the clock says. Let's count the seconds while we still can. Headphones on, world off. The nightmare is waiting. I was 41 that year, still heavy with the ghost of Linda, my wife. She had slipped away 3 years prior, taken by the quiet, brutal efficiency of cancer, leaving me with our daughter, Elara, who was 16 and rapidly becoming the only stable axis in a world that felt constantly tilted. I had retired early from the Ranger Corps, not because I was tired of the silent peaks. I knew every hidden crease and scarred elevation of that massive range, but because I needed time to watch Elara breathe, to ensure she wasn't also a phantom I might wake up without. The peaks hold secrets. Anyone who has spent long enough among the crags and ancient cedars knows that the land doesn't just hold history, it holds time. The call came on a cold October morning in 1995. Dr. Marcus Thorne, a specialist in rare geological isotopes, had vanished. Eris wasn't a tourist. She was meticulous, seasoned, and carried a personal tracker that had suddenly, inexplicably, flatlined near an area known locally as the Stone Vale, a jumble of ancient, unstable basalt columns perpetually shrouded in thick cloud cover. The official search was brief and predictable: harsh weather, likely accident, body recovery impossible. But Eris had left a trail, not of broken branches, but of geological markers and odd, cryptic notes about a temporal rift. Her notes mentioned the ancient local belief that the 4 peaks visible from the valley floor represented the 4 cardinal directions, grounding reality. But what about the 5th? In the old tribal teachings I had picked up over decades spent patrolling these lands, there was always talk of the null direction, the inner path, the place where all vectors collapse back upon themselves. It was folklore, something told to scare children away from dangerous ravines, until I found Eris's last marker, a stack of river stones balanced impossibly high, bearing the symbol of an eye with a spiral pupil, the traditional sign of the hidden 5th summit. My curiosity was a knife scraping against a deep-seated fear, the fear that Eris hadn't been lost. She had found what she was looking for. And I knew, with the visceral dread that only comes from knowing the mountain is calling, that the Rangers would never find this path. I had to go alone. I spent 4 days climbing, moving beyond the recognized boundaries, following instincts honed by decades of isolation. The air grew thinner, yes, but the silence became something else, heavy, oily, like breathing pulverized glass. It was the absence of all ambient sound. No insects, no wind moving the stunted pines, no cry of raptors. It was perfect, absolute acoustic stasis. I found the rift high above the timberline. It wasn't a visible gap, but a shift in light and perception. The air here shimmered with heat despite the freezing temperature. I remember stepping through a narrow chute between 2 slate slabs. One moment, I was shivering in the alpine chill. The next, I was bathed in a gentle, warm light, standing in a small, impossibly green valley shielded from the outside world. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. And standing there, I felt washed by the mountain itself. This wasn't a standard geological feature. The rocks here were entirely different, smoother, edged with glyphs that seemed to writhe slightly if I stared too long. This was the obscured peak, the Chronos Summit. Almost immediately, I encountered Silas. He sat cross-legged near a pool of unnaturally still water, carving wood. Silas looked like a man in his late 60s, weathered and wise, but his eyes held an alarming depth, suggesting centuries, not decades. His clothes were the traditional woolen kind worn by guides 100 years ago. He smiled when he saw my park badge, a wry, tired expression. "You've carried the symbols of the outside world a long way, Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to come from the soil itself. I asked him how he knew my name. He merely gestured to the carvings. "Time is simple here. It flows, yes, but not in a river, only in the deepest pool. We call this the null direction because it allows existence without consequence. No decay, no illness, no hunger, not truly. It is the eternal present." I tried to ground myself in what I knew. The geological fact of the Pacific Northwest is its intense tectonic activity, creating immense pressure and strange magnetic fields. Could such pressure create a localized temporal anomaly? I had always dismissed the idea of a fifth direction, thinking it referred metaphorically to the inner self. But here, it was physical, manifest. Silas explained the impossible truth of the mountain. You do not age here. A genetic marker that would kill you in the valley simply stops operating. It is a reprieve, a place for those who wish to avoid the ending. Then came the chilling speculative concept. The Chronos Summit acts as a metaphysical capacitor. It absorbs the flow of linear time from the external world, storing it in its core, resulting in a devastating temporal disparity. Silas explained a ratio, an almost unbelievable rule that would become the axis of my future dread. For every sunrise you witness here, 1 month passes outside. I was there for the researcher, Marcus Thorne. Silas led me to a small settlement. A few structures built of smooth, pale stone, perfectly maintained. And there she was. Eris looked exactly as she did in her missing persons photo, vibrant and healthy, dressed in clothes that should have been ragged after weeks, but were pristine. She was sketching geological formations with the intensity of someone who finally had all the time in the world. When I confronted her, she looked at my tired face, my eyes hollowed by grief and the rough climb, and smiled with pity. "Marcus, you look exhausted." "My illness, the one that gives me 5 years, tops? Here, it means nothing. I'm healthy. I'm cured," I pleaded, showing her the distress calls, the official searches. I told her that her family believed she was dead. "They believe what they must," she replied, her voice lacking any true emotional weight. "I have infinite time to study infinite stillness. That is a fair trade for the finite pain of watching a body degrade." She was fully detached, not mad, but simply operating on a completely different framework of existence. She had chosen stasis over suffering, immortality over meaning. It was profoundly unsettling. I spent less than 12 hours on the obscured peak. I ate bland, sustaining food offered by Silas, who reminded me that the price of eternal life here was the loss of the living world. I saw the relief in Eris's eyes, the profound peace that comes from knowing you will never, ever change. I left before the next sunrise, knowing that even those few hours had cost me days out there. I had to return to Elara. Climbing back through the slate chute, the cold hit me like a physical blow, and the cacophony of the valley, wind, buzzing flies, the crunch of gravel, was deafening after the perfect silence of the peak. When I made it back to the ranger station, My colleagues looked at me strangely. I had been gone 6 days. 6 days on Earth. 6 days of fear for Elara. I filed the report. Marcus Thorne, lost and presumed deceased in an unsurvivable ravine. I carried the truth like a massive, burning stone in my chest. I had seen the secret path to forever. I had witnessed the ultimate escape hatch from mortality. And I knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who has lost everything once, that this place would forever be waiting for me. I looked at the dark photo of Linda on my desk, then at Elara's laughing face in the next frame. The mountain was terrifying, but the promise it offered, the sheer escape from time and decay, was more seductive than any physical siren's song. It was the ultimate, horrifying comfort. The 6 days I'd spent gone were quickly absorbed by the routine grind of raising Elara and policing a remote, isolated corner of the world. But the mountain had marked me. Every time I looked towards the silent peaks, the invisible fissure of the null direction seemed to pulse, a constant, low-grade thrum of possibility. I tried to forget Silas and Eris, tried to bury the memory of the perfect, terrifying stasis I had witnessed. Yet, the knowledge that an exit existed from the linear cruelty of time corrupted my every waking moment. Elara was growing, rapidly becoming a young woman, a change I watched with both fierce pride and a sickening dread. Every birthday, every graduation, was a tick on the clock I was now acutely aware of. Since Linda's death, I had lived in fear of the inevitable, and now I knew a place where inevitability was simply canceled. Between 1995 and 2013, I ran across 3 distinct cases that brought the Chronos Summit rushing back into the foreground of my fractured mind. Each encounter felt less like coincidence and more like the mountain subtly flexing its influence, reaching out to gather its chosen. The first was the Rinaldi family in 2003. William, Ruth, and their son Daniel. Ruth had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of multiple sclerosis, a disease that promised a long, agonizing decline. They sold their ranch, liquidated everything, and told the few neighbors they had that they were moving east for specialized treatment. But a month later, I found William's truck abandoned, pristine, parked strategically near the stone veil, the precise entry point to the obscured peak. Inside, a note was tucked into the sun visor. It was written by William, addressed to no one in particular, but meant for whoever understood the path. We choose the present, Marcus. Ruth will never suffer again. Danny will always be 8. The emotional impact of that statement, that little Daniel would be frozen forever at the perfect, innocent age of 8, robbed of future complexity but saved from any potential sorrow, was profoundly disturbing. It was the ultimate, selfish act of love. They had traded a messy, finite existence for a clean, eternal one. I drove the truck back down, filed another presumed lost report, and watched the mountain range loom silently. I knew Ruth was walking on solid legs up there. Danny was throwing a ball in a place where the sun never truly moved. Then, in 2009, I met Thomas. Thomas was an outcast, a brilliant but lonely craftsman who worked in old copper and brass. He was 50, unmarried, and profoundly depressed. He didn't have a terminal illness. He simply had nothing left to live for, or so he believed. He showed up at the station one day, calm, almost beatific, asking about the ancient legends of the fifth direction. A profound, ancient truth rooted in psychological understanding is that existential dread stems not just from fear of death, but from the fear of a meaningless existence. Thomas was seeking not immortality, but relief from meaninglessness. I tried to warn him off, telling him the official stories of hypothermia and false. But Thomas simply looked through me, his eyes already distant, fixed on some internal horizon. "It's not death I fear, Ranger," he said softly. "It's the endless, grinding expectation of tomorrow. I need a place where every day is today. I hear they need skilled hands up there, carvers, builders. I hear the material is endless." I didn't stop him. I realized the mountain didn't just appeal to the sick. It appealed to the weary, the isolated, and those who saw the entropy of the universe as a personal insult. Thomas disappeared a week later. The mountain had become a speculative concept in my life, an invisible, magnetic force drawing broken souls into its pocket of temporal stillness. It was the ultimate comfort object, offering a life free of the pain of progression. During these years, Elara became the only thing keeping me moored to the reality of linear time. She graduated high school, chose a path in teaching, and met Michael, a kind, steady man who saw the light she carried. I was proud, terrified, and constantly reflecting on the fragile nature of their happiness. Reflective thought. We think of mortality as a punishment, but perhaps it's the scarcity of time that forces us to assign value to every moment, every touch, every word spoken. Up there, on the peak, everything had infinite value, and therefore, no value at all. I was 59 years old in 2013. Elara was 34, married, successful, and beginning to talk about children. I felt the profound, overwhelming weight of my age. It started as a dull ache, then an unrelenting spike of pain just beneath my ribs. The fatigue was bone deep, not the tiredness of a long shift, but the weariness of a failing biological machine. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to stress, to old injuries. But the dread I had carried for Linda's memory began to shift, coalescing into a terrifying personalized reality. The diagnosis arrived 3 weeks before Elara's birthday: pancreatic cancer. Aggressive, 6 months to a year, at best. The doctor's words were a death sentence delivered in a sterile office, but they were also a bizarre kind of liberation. For 18 years, I had known about the escape hatch. Now, I had the perfect, unimpeachable reason to use it. The promise of the mountain, no decay, no illness, was no longer an abstract luxury. It was the only way to cheat the darkness closing in on me. I looked at Elara, vibrant and planning her future, and a cold, self-preserving logic clicked into place. If I stayed down here, I would only be a burden, a shadow of pain, eventually leaving her with the second great loss of her life. If I went up, I could freeze myself, preserve the man she knew, healthy, strong, eternally 59, and simply fade from her present, preventing the agonizing goodbye. It was cowardice dressed as sacrifice. The decision was swift, clinical. I took 2 weeks to settle my affairs, giving the illusion of a sudden, necessary journey. I told Elara I was taking an extended solo trek into the deeper wilderness, a cleansing trip I needed after the years of loss and work. She was worried, but she understood my need for solitude. We shared a final, perfect dinner, discussing her hopes for a new school year, her desire for a boy, maybe a girl, maybe both. I held her hand, feeling the warmth of her young, strong pulse, knowing I was trading this fleeting moment for infinite stillness. I drove the Ranger truck one last time to the Stone Vale. The old dread was gone, replaced by a terrible resolve. The air was crisp, the mountains massive and unyielding. I left my badge, the symbol of my duty to the external, changing world, on the dashboard, a silver reflection of the setting sun. I began the climb, the pain in my side sharpening with every ascent. I was climbing toward the null direction, toward a place where this crushing inevitability would simply cease to exist. I was choosing eternal health over the messy, precious reality of suffering and connection. I was choosing me, healthy, over us, whole. I felt the shift near the summit, the sudden cessation of wind, the overwhelming silence. I stepped through the slate fissure, collapsing onto the unnaturally soft, green grass of the Chronos Summit. The pain vanished instantly. It wasn't relief. It was a profound, shocking hollowness. The biological markers of cancer, the inflammation, the necrotic cells, the agonizing pressure, they hadn't been cured. They had simply been paused. I was healthy again, forever 59. Silas found me there, sitting in the unnaturally warm sunlight, breathing easily for the first time in months. "Welcome back, Marcus Thorne," Silas greeted me, his voice as dry and eternal as the stone. "You chose the present." I nodded, utterly exhausted. I had achieved immortality. But as I looked back down the massive slope toward the valley where Elara was sleeping, I realized I had also just chosen a solitude deeper and colder than death itself. I had escaped time, only to be trapped by it. The true horror was only just beginning to unfurl. The Chronos Summit was beautiful, in a sterile, frightening way. Everything was impeccably maintained, not by human effort, but by the mountain's intrinsic resistance to decay. Marcus Thorne was still there, vibrant and focused, now teaching basic physics to the children of the Rinaldi family. Daniel, eternally 8, and a handful of other children whose parents had made the same choice. Thomas, the copper craftsman, worked silently in a small shed, forging intricate metal flowers that would never wilt. They were a community of the spared, living in a perfect, eternal afternoon. But I found no comfort in this arrested existence. The lack of change was a constant, screaming silence. When you know you have endless time, the incentive to do anything dissolves. Motivation, progress, even simple desire. These are concepts rooted in the scarcity of moments. Here, moments were currency without end, and therefore worthless. Silas, the elder, understood my restless dread. He led me to the center of the small settlement, where the stillness of the water was most profound, the place he had been carving near during my first visit in 1995. It was a large, obsidian basin, naturally carved, filled with the clear, mineral-rich water of the peak. Silas called it the Scrying Pool, or the Mirror of Flow. "We are outside of time, Marcus," Silas explained, standing beside me. His face, unlined by age, carried the weight of witnessing too much external change. But the external world still flows. The pool is an aperture. It allows us to perceive linear time, accelerating or slowing the view depending on our proximity and focus. This was the terrifying gift of the null direction, the ability to witness the world you abandoned, accelerated to an agonizing speed. I looked into the mirror pool. Silas told me to focus on what kept me tethered to the world of suffering. My mind instantly conjured Elara. The water shifted, shimmering like oil on metal. And suddenly, there she was. But not the 34-year-old woman I had kissed goodbye just moments ago on the external timeline. The image was grainy, moving fast, like an old film reel struggling to catch up. I saw Elara, now perhaps 40, her hair a bit darker, standing in a large, bright classroom, teaching. I saw Michael, her husband, older, happier, holding her hand. The image was relentless. "How long has this been running?" I demanded, my throat tight. Silas gave me the cruel, cold truth. "You have been here, in the eternal present, for what feels like 3 weeks, Marcus. 3 perfect weeks of health. Outside, 3 years." The temporal ratio was exponentially worse than I had feared. The longer I stayed, the faster my loved ones would age, the faster my precious external timeline would collapse. Every day of my peaceful, perfect life cost Elara a month. My escape had become her acceleration toward the grave. I became obsessed with the mirror pool. It was the only thing that gave my endless, changeless existence any structure. I would spend what felt like days, weeks, staring into the black water, watching the life I had chosen to forfeit unfold at high speed. I watched Elara turn 45. I saw her and Michael renovating their home. I saw the first gray hairs at Michael's temples. Then, the true horror of my selfish choice manifested. I watched the birth of my first granddaughter, Elara holding a tiny, red-faced infant, pure joy radiating from the grainy, accelerated image. They named her Linda, after my lost wife. I felt a punch of grief so severe it buckled my knees. I had missed it. I had traded the visceral reality of that moment. The smell of the hospital, the sound of her first cry, the exhaustion and pride on Elara's face, for perfect health on a dead mountain. I was a ghost watching a party I was supposed to host. I retreated from the community. Eris and the Rinaldi family, living their perfect loop, saw me as an anomaly, the one person who regretted their immortality. They had achieved peace through detachment. I was experiencing perpetual, accelerated loss through constant observation. Reflective thought. The deepest prison is not isolation, but the knowledge of what you are missing, without the capacity to ever retrieve it. The years flowed outside like a torrent, captured and displayed in the Scrying Pool. On the mountain, time was merely a mood, a feeling of endless afternoons. Outside, it was a precise, brutal executioner. I watched Linda grow up. I saw Elara change from a young mother to a settled, respected principal at her school. Her life was full, defined by love and small, meaningful struggles. She was happy, which was both a source of relief and profound agony. She had moved on without me, perhaps assuming my self-imposed solitude had led to an unsentimental end deep in the wilderness. I tried to rationalize my stay. I reminded myself of the tumor, the crushing reality of a body betraying itself. If I had stayed, I would have caused Elara years of pain, watching me waste away. This was cleaner, wasn't it? A sudden absence, not a slow, visible decay. This existential justification was the grounding fact I clung to. Medically, pancreatic cancer is one of the most ruthless forms of mortality. My choice had been a rational response to inevitable suffering. But the rational mind is a poor defense against the heart. By the time I saw Linda graduate high school, I had been on the peak for 4 subjective years. For years of perfect health. I asked Silas to calculate the cost. He pressed his ancient fingers into the smooth stone surrounding the pool. "Marcus," he whispered, his eyes distant. 50 years have flowed in the valley since you left. 50 years. Elara was 84. The mountain had stolen half a century from me, compressed into 4 years of my waking reality. The temporal disparity had steepened exponentially the longer I lingered. Every perfect day I enjoyed now cost Elara a year. The realization was a crushing weight. I was a temporal vampire, draining the precious, finite life force of the external world to sustain my own endless, worthless existence. I rushed back to the pool. The light was failing in the external world. I saw Elara, now frail, sitting in a chair by a window, the setting sun casting long shadows across her wrinkled face. She looked peaceful, but diminished. She was at the very end of her allotted span. I watched her great-granddaughter, a young woman who looked disturbingly like a youthful Elara, bring her a cup of tea. She was wearing a uniform, the dark green and tan of the local police. "That," Silas observed quietly, "is Jenna, your great-granddaughter. She is a fine officer. And she carries your badge number, Marcus. A small coincidence. The world trying to reconcile your absence." I stared at the woman I had sacrificed my life for, my daughter, aged, fading, beautiful, and utterly unaware that her father was watching her final breaths from a pocket dimension of endless mourning. My immortality, which I had seized out of terror, was revealed as the most horrific curse imaginable. I had escaped the suffering of death, only to endure the endless suffering of witnessing life without contribution. I had chosen health over connection, and the price was 50 years of lost love. I pressed my hands against the water, desperate to reach her, to tell her I hadn't abandoned her, that I was simply waiting on the edge of time. Elara smiled faintly at the setting sun. I knew what was coming. The clock was striking for her, and I realized that the choice I made 50 years ago was meaningless if I didn't undo it now. I needed to return, not to live, but simply to touch her hand one last time before the shadows took us both. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. I had gained nothing and lost everything. My eternal health, my reprieve from cancer, was a sterile achievement, a monument built to my own fear. Elara, my daughter, my anchor, was dying. And because I had spent 4 blissful, unchanging years on the Chronos Summit, 50 years had been stripped from her life without the presence of her father. I had robbed her of my company and robbed myself of the beauty of her progression. I turned away from the Scrying Pool, the accelerating image of Elara's inevitable decline burning into my vision. The others on the peak, Eris, the Rinaldi family, Thomas, looked at me with detached pity. They had found peace in the void. I had found only agonizing clarity. I ran to Silas. He was near the slate fissure, preparing a simple meal that would satisfy hunger without ever truly banishing it. Silas, I need to go back, I said, the words urgent raw. He stopped, placing a handful of pale berries back into his woven pouch. He looked at me, not with surprise, but with ancient resignation. We don't go back, Marcus. We remain. That is the fundamental promise of the null direction. You exchange the future for the now. But I have to see her, I pleaded, the panic making my voice tremble. She's at the end. I can't let her die thinking I abandoned her. I need to accept my time. Silas sighed, a sound like dry leaves scattering across stone. The path through the fissure is not a reversible door, Marcus. The temporal disparity is like a wave. You were carried here on the crest. To return now, you must fight the entire ocean of time you accumulated. I pressed him relentlessly, demanding the speculative concept, the method, to reverse the flow. There is a ritual, Silas conceded, his voice barely audible. It is rarely spoken of, mostly because no one in the long history of this peak has ever chosen to use it. It is the ritual of the counterflow. He explained that the mountain, in its role as a temporal capacitor, retained a trace of the life force of those it had saved. To return to the linear timeline, I would not only have to physically descend the slope, but I would have to internally accept the entire 50 years I had skipped. That meant accepting the instant, fatal resurgence of the cancer that had been dormant for 4 mountain years. You will return to the precise biological moment you left, Silas warned, his eyes stern. But you will bring with you the cumulative weight of the external time. Your body will instantly experience 50 years of decay, suffering, and the immediate, aggressive terminal velocity of the illness you ran from. You will die, Marcus. You will die immediately, violently, and with all the accumulated pain of half a century. He paused, letting the silence of the peak amplify the dread. And you will lose the benefit of this place forever. No return, no waiting, no reprieve. You will exchange your eternal future for perhaps an hour of true, physical present. The choice was agonizing, but simultaneously utterly simple. Immortality on the peak was a beautiful lie, The only truth left was Elara. Tell me how, I whispered. Silas led me to a high ledge overlooking the fissure. Below us, the valley was shrouded in the deep, external night. He instructed me to sit, to focus my entire being not on the fear of death, but on the connection I had sacrificed. This forced reflection became the grounding fact of the moment. Neurobiology teaches us that deep, meaningful attachments trigger complex neural pathways, the release of oxytocin and dopamine, that define our sense of self and purpose. On the peak, those pathways were starved. The love for Elara was the only residual stimulus I had left. I had to weaponize that love. You must visualize the entirety of her life, Silas instructed, his voice drifting in the unnaturally warm air. The baby steps you missed, the teenager's arguments you avoided, the quiet comfort of her middle age, the sight of her grandchildren growing up. Feel the loss of every single moment. You must allow 50 years of regret to become a physical object that your body can carry back down the temporal stream. I closed my eyes. The peak, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. I forced myself to see the milestones. Elara teaching her first class, Elara arguing playfully with Michael, Linda's birth, the growth spurts, the holidays, the quiet nights of old age. I didn't just remember. I felt the weight of the missing time. I felt the physical, aching absence of those 5 decades. A visceral pain began in my chest, rapidly spreading. It was not the cancer yet. It was pure, unadulterated regret, manifesting as a physical illness. My hands shook. The perfect, preserved 59-year-old body of Marcus Thorne began to fail, not from disease, but from the spiritual exhaustion of 50 years lived elsewhere. The temperature dropped instantly. The warm, eternal light of the peak was extinguished, replaced by the biting, aggressive cold of the external mountain. I knew the ritual was working. The mountain was casting me out, rejecting the incompatible presence of a soul that valued suffering and connection over sterile peace. Reflective thought. Fear often masks the greatest acts of love. I had run from death out of fear, only to realize that running from death meant running from life itself. As the light flickered, I looked back one last time at the small settlement. Eris was still teaching, immortal and eternally detached. Daniel Rinaldi was still 8, running after a ball that would never deflate. They were saved, but they were also suspended, perfectly preserved exhibits in a museum of time. They had traded complexity for simplicity, the chaos of living for the predictability of not dying. Silas gave me one last, cryptic warning. The mountain grants reunion Marcus, but only on the mountain's terms. You may find her, but you must hurry. I stood up, the pain in my pancreas now a blinding, white-hot fire, the biological clock accelerating to catastrophic speed. My skin felt suddenly brittle, my joints stiff, carrying the 50 years of unlived stress. I stepped toward the fissure. The moment I breached the slate chasm, the change was instantaneous and brutal. My eyes, which had been clear, felt gritty and dim. My breath, which had been easy, rasped in my throat. I felt a lifetime of weight slam into my knees. I looked at my hands. They were thin, veined, and spotted with the marks of accelerated age. I was 109 years old. The cancer, which had been paused, exploded into life, demanding the 50 years of progression it had been denied. I fell to my knees in the snow just outside the peak's protective shimmer. The world was cold, dark, and utterly real. I was dying. I had perhaps an hour, but I was laughing, a dry, rattling sound of triumph and absolute anguish. I had returned. I had reversed the irreversible. I had chosen death over immortality because death was the only thing that could lead me back to the truth of connection. I grabbed the thick cedar staff Silas had left for me and began the agonizing descent toward the valley. I was no longer Marcus Thorne, the 59-year-old ranger. I was a man returned from beyond time, a ghost carrying a half-century of deferred suffering, racing against the final collapse to find the one person who still mattered. The descent was an impossible agony. My body was disintegrating under the 50-year temporal shock. Every nerve ending screamed as the cancer, accelerating at an unimaginable rate, consumed me. The world outside the peak was brutally cold, heavy with gravity and the unforgiving sharpness of reality. Every step down the frozen scree cost me what felt like a year of life. I was driven only by the single, burning vision of Elara, old and frail, sitting by the window in the final moments of her life, 50 years below. Silas had warned me that the mountain granted reunion only on its own terms, and I understood the crushing implication. The temporal cost of my return meant I would only reach her at the very edge of her existence. It took me what felt like an eternity, perhaps 45 minutes of external time, but 45 minutes of accumulated, biological suffering equivalent to months of agony. I staggered onto the familiar track where I had left my truck half a century ago. The Ranger truck was long gone, replaced by a sleek, electric utility vehicle, the evidence of time's relentless march. I used the last of my strength to find a signal on the ancient, clunky satellite phone I had inexplicably carried with me. Perhaps the mountain had preserved it as a cruel joke. I managed to punch in the one number I still knew by heart, Elara's childhood home, now her final home. A young woman answered, her voice clear and alert. Hello? This is the BE residence. Jenna, I rasped, the name pulled from the deepest recesses of my memory, the name Silas had given me. This is Marcus. Marcus Thorne. I need to speak to Elara. Silence on the line. Then a sharp intake of breath. Who is this? Jenna demanded, her tone shifting instantly to the police officer's authority I recognized from the mirror pool. This is highly unusual. My great-grandmother is in hospice care. Who is Marcus Thorne? I am her father. I choked out, the pain nearly blinding me. Please, Jenna, tell her the ranger is home. Tell her I came back for the final dawn. The absurdity of the claim, a 109-year-old father returning after 50 years of silence, was lost in the desperate urgency of my voice. Jenna, the police officer, must have heard the profound, unnatural distress, the proximity to death, in my plea. She didn't hang up. Wait there. Don't move. I couldn't move if I tried. I lay against the cold, granite wall of the canyon, gasping. I was dissolving, the external world claiming its due. Minutes later, the most painful, excruciating minutes of my entire existence, I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. It was Jenna, driving the utility vehicle. She jumped out, saw my ruined, ancient form, and stopped dead. Her face was a mask of shock and disbelief. She didn't see the ghost of the 59-year-old ranger. She saw a man who should have been dead decades ago, reduced to dust by the environment. She knelt beside me, the professional training kicking in. You need a hospital. No. I seized her hand, the grip surprisingly strong. No time. Take me to Elara. Now. She helped me into the passenger seat, strapping me in, moving with the practiced efficiency of a first responder. The drive was a blur of excruciating jolts and gasping breaths. How is she? I forced the question out. It's just hours now, Jenna whispered, her eyes flicking between the road and my terrifyingly withered face. She's waiting. She was always waiting for something, she said. For closure. We reached the small house nestled in the pines. I recognized the porch railing Michael had rebuilt 30 years ago, a memory I had watched unfold in the pool. Jenna helped me inside. The air in the house was heavy with the smell of old wood, antiseptic, and the quiet dignity of approaching death. Elara was in the front room, bathed in the soft, fading light of the afternoon. She was impossibly fragile, her once vibrant skin paper-thin over bone. She was sleeping, hooked up to monitors. Jenna wheeled me close to her bedside. I looked at the woman I had lost 50 years of life with. The regret was 1,000 knives. I reached out my trembling, aged hand and placed it gently over hers. At the touch, Elara's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with age, but still unmistakably hers. She looked at my ruined face, my accelerated decay, the horror of what I had become. She showed no fear, only a deep, profound recognition. "Dad," she breathed, the sound barely a whisper. The use of that single, childhood word, spoken across 50 years of separation and the impossible boundaries of time, broke me. Tears streamed down my face, tears of joy and agony. "I'm sorry, Elara," I whispered, the words catching on the searing pain in my chest. "I chose wrong. I was afraid." She squeezed my hand, a gesture impossibly strong for her frailty. "You're here, Marcus. That's all that matters." In that moment, everything I had gained on the Chronos Summit, the eternal health, the endless days, the reprieve from suffering, was revealed as dust. This single, painful, finite touch was worth more than 1,000 years of perfect stasis. I had returned to life, just in time to embrace death. We lay there, side by side, holding hands, two people whose lives had flowed across radically different timelines, finally converging on the same moment. The monitors beside Elara began to emit a slow, rhythmic tone, elongating the pauses between beeps. I closed my eyes, accepting the finality. The pain in my chest was absolute, consuming. But woven into the agony was a transcendent, powerful peace. I was with her. I was home. I felt Elara's hand relax in mine. The monitor emitted a long, flat tone. At the exact same instant, the accelerated cancer completed its brutal work. I felt a cold, peaceful numbness spread from my center, finally silencing the pain. I died holding her hand, choosing love and connection over the ultimate escape. My last conscious thought was the overwhelming comfort of knowing I had made the right choice, even if it had cost me everything. The ranger, who had sought forever, found his true eternal peace in the space of a single, precious minute. The transition was less a passage into darkness and more an ascent into absolute, knowing calm. I did not move toward the light, nor did I drift into oblivion. Instead, I found myself, or rather, the essence of Marcus Thorne, back near the peak. Not physically present, but woven into the fabric of the null direction. The mountain, having taken my life force, which it instantly expended in the counterflow ritual, now claimed my spirit. I was once again in the perfect, silent afternoon, standing beside the Scrying Pool. Silas was there, his ancient eyes fixed on the tranquil water. "You fulfilled the conditions, Marcus," Silas acknowledged, a flicker of something close to respect in his gaze. "You accepted the price of time and connection. You chose the truth of suffering over the lie of stasis." I looked into the pool. The image of the little house in the valley was receding, becoming hazy. I saw Jenna making the arrangements, solemn and resolute. My death, simultaneous with Elara's, was a profound mystery to the outside world, an elderly man appearing from nowhere, dying immediately upon reunion with his great-grandmother. "So, this is the mountain's reunion?" I asked the void around Silas. "It is," he confirmed. "Your spirit remains here, free from the constraint of time, not in life, but in stasis. You wait. For what? Silas pointed to the pool, which showed the steady progression of external time, now flowing at its normal, agonizing pace. You waited for Elara. Now you wait for the next. My spirit was now part of the speculative concept of the mountain, a sentient memory bank, a ghost suspended in a perfect, eternal pause, waiting for the soul of my daughter to eventually find its way back to the only place that truly exists outside of time. I had accepted death for connection, and the mountain granted me an eternal vigil. 52 external years passed. The mountain kept its perfect silence. I watched the world change, the rise of new cities, the refinement of technology, the slow march of human progress and human folly. It was detached, but not agonizing. I was simply an observer now, no longer tethered by the ticking clock. Then, the focus of the scrying pool shifted again, aligning itself with the life of Jenna B., Elara's great-granddaughter. Jenna grew up, becoming a decorated police chief, haunted by the strange story of the returning old man and the cryptic badge he left behind. She carried the family legacy, duty, responsibility, and an undercurrent of fierce, inherited melancholy. In 2075, Jenna was 58 years old. She had achieved everything she set out to do. But she also carried a diagnosis: hereditary, early-onset Alzheimer's. The slow, creeping decay of the mind, a biological inevitability that promised to steal her life long before her body failed. The fear of erasure, the absolute dread of forgetting her mission, her family, and the legacy she carried, began to dominate her existence. This brought her, inevitably, back to the silent peaks. She was searching, driven by the same fear of biological entropy that had driven me 50 years before. She used the old, archived maps, the cryptic notes left by her great-grandmother detailing the location of the Ranger's final trek. I watched her approach the stone vale, dressed in a sleek, protective field suit that looked impossibly advanced. She was searching for the solution, the eternal pause. This moment forced me to revisit the core grounding fact. The human brain, in the face of inevitable mental decay, often seeks a permanent anchor, a fixed point of self-identity. The Chronos Summit offered the ultimate, fixed identity. Jenna found the slate fissure. She saw the change in the light, the overwhelming silence. She knew she was standing at the threshold of the eternal present. She could step through, freeze herself at 58, and retain her mind, her memories, forever, escaping the relentless destruction of her illness. I desperately wanted her to come in. I was waiting. Elara was waiting. We could finally be a family again, suspended in perfect stillness. But Jenna stopped just short of the temporal threshold. She placed her hand on the cold stone, feeling the unnatural warmth of the peak's aura. She pulled out a small, metallic object, a recording device. She spoke into it, her voice strong, resonant, utterly present. My name is Jenna B. I have found the fifth direction, the Chronos Summit. I know what it offers. I know the exchange. She paused, looking toward the silence. My great-grandmother, Elara, chose a full, messy life. My great-great-grandfather, Marcus, chose a swift death for a single moment of connection. I have been given the option of infinite sanity, purchased by the isolation of the null direction. She closed her eyes, and I could sense the immense internal struggle, the push and pull between the safety of eternal stasis and the risk of catastrophic loss. Reflective thought. Legacy isn't about what we leave behind, but the decisions we make in the face of our greatest fears, which then serve as a path for those who follow. Jenna opened her eyes. A fierce resolution settled in her expression. I choose to postpone, she stated clearly. I have one more project, a major reform initiative at the precinct. If I go in now, that mission fails. If I stay, I risk losing myself, but I fulfill my duty. If I lose my mind in 10 years, so be it. But those 10 years will be spent doing, not waiting. She placed the recording device on a small, stable ledge, a message for anyone who might follow. She then turned her back on the perfect, silent reprieve of the peak. She stepped away from the fissure and began the long, determined descent back into the flowing, finite reality of 2075. She chose to face the chaos of time, the inevitability of illness, and the certainty of forgetting, all for the sake of the meaning she found in her immediate, real life. I stood beside Silas, watching her vanish down the slope. The mountain had offered escape to 3 generations. 2 had succumbed to the lure, myself briefly, and Eris permanently. 1 had chosen duty. She will be back, eventually, Silas observed, dryly. When the time comes, the path is always open. But I knew she wouldn't be back until she had truly lived, until she had fulfilled the promise of her finite, precious existence. And so, I wait on the Chronos Summit, a spirit preserved by the mountain, observing the flow of the world, understanding that the true reward of life is not the absence of an ending, but the quality of the journey to reach it. I wait for Elara's return, and I observe the powerful, messy choices of the living. The shadows that cling to the Chronos Summit never truly recede, but sometimes the deep indigo of the external night softens, allowing a ghost of dawn to penetrate the void. I feel that shift now, a lessening of the pressure, a slow dispersal of the density that defines the null direction. The nightmare is over, the impossible choice has been made, and the temporal currents are stabilizing, settling back into their relentless, linear groove. If you are still with me, listen closely to the silence around you. It should feel empty now, no longer heavy with possibility. The obscured peak has done its work for the night, collecting its souls and challenging the living. I sit by the Scrying Pool, which is now just water, reflecting the cold, distant light of the external sunrise. My vigil is eternal, yes, but it is no longer agonizing. I learned that the horror of immortality is the horror of meaninglessness, and by sacrificing my perfect health for a single moment of painful connection, I endowed my eternal waiting with purpose. I am the mountain's lonely shepherd, watching the future unfold, a ghost who finally understood the value of mortality. I watch the timeline of Genevieve now. She is focused, successful, and slowly, gently, losing small fragments of herself to the hereditary sickness she chose to face. She is living fully, aggressively, valuing every coherent moment she has left, creating her legacy right now, in the flow of time, rather than preserving a sterile version of herself in the stasis of the peak. She is making her choice mean something. I wait for Elara, knowing that her soul, free now of its body,